He came to national prominence as White House Counsel to President Nixon and became deeply involved in events leading to the Watergate break-in. He was even referred to by the FBI as the master manipulator of the cover-up. Convicted of multiple felonies, he went on to become a key witness for the prosecution. Today, he is a popular commentator on contemporary politics who supports the impeachment of President Bush. Hello, I'm Ernie Manouse. Coming up on Interviews, our conversation with best-selling author and columnist John Dean. Do you remember the feeling you had the first time you walked in the Oval Office?
I do. The office was empty. I went in with another aide just to look around. I was actually being given, I'd just arrived at the White House, and one of my predecessor's assistants was giving me a tour, everything from the Oval Office to the way the tracking device followed the president around, so the Secret Service knew where he was at any time. I didn't know that there was a taping machine hooked up to it.
Yeah.
But I looked at it and I noticed, for example, things like the fact there's an eagle on the ceiling that sort of corresponded to the one that Nixon had in his oval rug that he'd had made. So it was just a feeling of just more like walking into a museum piece, if you will, than actually feeling it with a president in it.
Does it strike you, though, that this is the room where so much of history had taken place, that you're in this moment and that you, this just guy, is now standing there? Does that hit you?
Well, one of the things I did notice, for example, on the floor is they still have left the scar marks, which they've now covered over from Eisenhower wearing golf shoes on the wood. and at that time I was a golfer, so that I thought that's impressive that the president wore his golf shoes in the Oval Office. But yes, you have a lot of sense of history, but as I say, when nobody's in there, when nothing's happening, it is just it's sort of just a magnificent room. It was clearly, the design was fascinating. I knew the history of it, that Taft had been the man who'd created the Oval Office, something in his image, I think. But it's a very well functioning office, the way it's set up. Also, you can't see all the doors until you actually notice there's a knob on the middle of the wall and that door opens there. The setting around the fireplace is so familiar to all of us because we've seen so many news clips from it. It is not as compact looking when you're actually in the room as when it catches it on the camera.
Oh, really?
What's also interesting, I've got to tell you though, in a number of movies where they literally duplicated the Oval Office and then torn it apart so they can shoot half scenes and what have you, it's striking how many sets I've been on over the years where they've actually duplicated the office.
Yeah. Do you remember the last time you were in there?
The last time I was in there was probably it would have been early April of 1973.
Do you remember how you were feeling at that point?
Well, I do. That was as Watergate was coming crashing down. I'd told the president that I was dealing with the prosecutors. I'd already earlier told him that he had a cancer on his presidency and that he had to do something. My mindset at that point was that I was going to step forward and try to force my colleagues to step forward and for us all to be accountable. I thought naively that would save the Nixon presidency. And at this particular, the last time I was in the Oval Office was when Nixon slid across the desk two suggested letters of resignation, which I later learned he had not been he'd said he'd written them both. As alternatives, I learned later that John Ehrlichman had written them both, and they were open confessions. Yeah. And I looked at the leader of the Western world and told him, I said, there's no way I can sign these, Mr. President. Let me draft my own. If you want one, I'll give you one you can put in your drawer and use whenever you want to. And he backed right down. It's very curious to have heard the tapes following my meeting where Nixon tells Ehrlichman and Haldeman, who come in the other door as I leave, how tough he was with me. And in fact, he was anything but. The only thing that he said that was sort of tough is he said, "Now, John, you know those national security matters, like those break-ins and what have you, and I don't want you talking about or testifying about any of that stuff. That's all protected by national security." He would later yield on that because they were crimes, and that there's a question of how far national security goes in protecting matters like that.
The way he's represented in modern culture and in the popular culture, I should say, is that the man you knew?
Well, I think the most recent and dominant portrayal is Oliver Stone's film Nixon. I actually teach. For years I've been over at USC as a visiting scholar, and one of the classes I lecture in, the professor uses that film as a part of a communications tool, and so I've watched it over the years to see how it holds up. And it surprisingly well. I can actually suspend belief at one point that Anthony Hopkins is Richard Nixon. I can sort of forget, except every now and then that little clipped British accent slides in that the voice coach was unable to get out, or they didn't get out in the looping. But having worked on the film and watching it on the screen then, I'm surprised at how fair, and it's not a photograph, it's not a documentary, it's a portrait of Nixon, and it's a pretty accurate portrait. Hopkins was very sympathetic to Nixon. He'd actually gone out to Yorba Linda to visit Nixon's childhood home. He told me the first day I met him, when he was playing the role, we were having lunch together, because I was a source for them to get sort of verisimilitude about what had happened in the Nixon White House. And Hopkins said to me, you know, we actually didn't announce ourselves going, he and Oliver Stone had gone out. He said, we didn't announce ourselves going to the Nixon home and library. And so we sort of went through it, and we thought we'd made it all the way when a librarian shows up and said, oh, I see who you are. And I started talking and said, yes, we're doing a film, and I'm playing Nixon. And she said to him, she said, well, I hope you're not doing a job, a hatchet job on Mr. Nixon. And Hopkins said, oh, no, I assure you I'm not. And he turned to me at the lunch and said, I'm not, am I, John? And I said, I really don't think you are. I think it's a fair picture and a fair portrait. So he was very conscious of that. He said, you know, when he got into this part of the president's birthplace, in the little room he grew up in, he said, you know, I have read about Nixon and him hearing the whistle trains go by and imagining where his own life might go. He said, you know, I totally identified with that because I came from rather humble beginnings myself and have made a long trip. So I think he played Nixon with a special empathy.
Yeah. Is it strange to see yourself portrayed on screen? In this case, David Hyde Pierce played you.
Yes, I've been portrayed by several people, and most recently in that film, David Hyde Pierce, who talked to me, read my books that were out at that time, my books about Watergate, and talked to me at some length about it, and I think played it as straight as he could in that film.
Yeah.
But you know, I just recognize somebody playing me in the film. I don't suspend belief when.
But it must be funny to see what was your life being portrayed, stories written about it, reading it in books, magazines, having your whole self in a way exposed.
It is. It's interesting. It's something that you sort of build up a protective device where you don't let yourself get too involved in the way the portrait is presented. You know, I know who I am, and sometimes they get it right, sometimes they don't. So it's curious in that sense. But I don't. You know, I think to be a public person, if you don't have a pretty good hide, you shouldn't be out there. Right. My wife, for example, is a very private person. She, when was played, you know, my book Blind Ambition was made into a miniseries by CBS that played years ago, a 6-part series, and she was very distressed about the role that she was presented as, which was either crying and breaking down or bitching. And this was it. And Teresa Russell that was one of her first big roles at the time. She's a great little actress now. At that time, she was just learning the ropes, and those were the two things she did the best, so everything else ended up on the cutting room floor. And Mo was not very happy about it.
Yeah. Were you one of the bad guys? When you look back at it, there were people breaking the laws in the White House. when you look back on it, were you one of the bad guys?
I never knowingly broke a law. Let me explain that. I've often thought, in hindsight, in fact, it was very clear to me some things that I was able to turn off. For example, when an aide came in who'd worked for my predecessor and told me that Chuck Colson, another aide, had asked him to firebomb the Brookings Institute, I said, "Hey, Jack, stop! Wait a minute. This is absolutely beyond the boundaries." Got on the next courier flight from Washington to San Clemente to visit Ehrlichman and Haldeman, or the president if necessary, to make sure this didn't go forward, and indeed stopped it. It didn't take a law degree to even know that was a wrong thing to do. I just slowly accumulated knowledge because people would tell me about things, and often they had already happened before I learned about them. As a result of my going to California, for example, and turning off the firebombing of the Brookings, which was insane. In fact, it would have been a capital offense if anybody had died in it. Right. I was excluded from an awful lot of the so-called dirty tricks and what have you. I was told by one of the persons involved that Bud Krogh, who was roughly my age, that he was setting up an operation that normally would have been handled in the counsel's office, but a lot of people in California at that time, because the Western White House was operating, thought I was a bit of a little old lady and not having the spirit for these things. So the answer is no, and I always thought that a White House counsel had a responsibility to tell a president no, and I did that my very first assignment from Nixon and on. Yes, they tried to roll me on a couple things, and I would just stall them. But I never really thought, I was willing to break the law openly for Nixon or anybody else. And I told them very early, if this thing falls apart, I'll never lie for anybody. I'm going to tell the truth. So the fact that we got ourselves in the middle of a conspiracy to obstruct justice, had I been trained in the criminal law, which never occurred to me that you needed that to be White House counsel, but I now realize in that particular presidency it was essential. And actually, ever since Watergate, all White House counsel have had either the experience himself or somebody on their staff who has a real background in criminal law. As I say, I didn't think in terms of obstruction of justice until pretty far into this thing, when I pulled the statutes down and started reading some of the cases and realized this hush money business is clearly an obstruction of justice. While it may be painted as a defense fund for these guys that got arrested, we're paying them to keep their mouth shut. And that became very clear when Howard Hunt sent a direct request to the White House that if he didn't get $120,000 yesterday, he was going to have some seamy things to say about what he'd done for John Ehrlichman.
When you're in the middle of all of this, though, and you're a young man working in the White House for a presidency, you've really never done this before, do you wonder if this is just business as usual? I
did. This is truly one of the things I kept asking myself, thinking maybe I don't understand how it's played in the big leagues. And in fact, at one point, Nixon gives me the assignment to go back and find precedents for everything that's gone astray during his presidency. And indeed, I talked to old-timers at the FBI, a guy by the name of Bill Sullivan, who'd been an associate director, and a lot of other characters who I could get a lot of lure and some of the underbelly described to me of the presidency. And I found, indeed, there were precedents for most everything you would put in that litany of so-called Watergate abuses. The difference was, though, it had become something of a standard operating procedure in the Nixon White House, whereas they'd been the exception to the rule in prior presidencies. But Nixon took great comfort. And in fact, in several of my books I've mentioned, and in particular one of my last books, that this explanation of because prior presidents have done it is a huge justification that a sitting president will use. And it's a very dangerous precedent. It's the two political wrongs make a political right. It makes no sense to me, and I think it's a specious argument, but it's used and dangerously so. So I did think at first that, well, maybe this is the way it's played. Particularly this gray area of national security, where there are no laws, there's very little public knowledge, there's very little information, and when I first heard, for example, that the president had wiretapped a number of news people, to prevent leaks from the White House. That sounded to me perfectly legitimate. I mean, it's because it was affecting his ability as the President of the United States to make decisions, because his options were being precluded because somebody on the national security staff was leaking this stuff to the New York Times. This was not a healthy situation, because you're precluding the ability of the man we put in charge of our foreign policy to act in the best interest of the country by exposing them. But I think a lot of the so-called Watergate abuses, had Nixon ever gone to trial in the Senate with an impeachment, he would have used a national security defense to explain a lot of it. That probably would have clarified a lot of it. So we go into today still very clouded about what is proper and what is improper in this gray area.
Before we move on to today, my one question that keeps coming up when I was reading stuff on you and looking into it, as the White House Counsel, is your job to defend the president, or is your job to stand for the people? Who is your boss?
I think it's neither in the particular sense. The oath you take is to support and defend the Constitution.
Okay.
So what you clearly do not take is an oath to support the president. I think Alberto Gonzales, for example, got confused as to who was his client, and the client is in the broadest interest, the American people, and the office of the president, that institution, not a particular man who sits in the chair or woman who will someday sit in the chair. So in the sense, I always envisioned it as much, I had a constitutional responsibility, and while you serve at the pleasure of the president, and you're not there unless the president thinks you're pleasing him, you still have to gauge your conduct accordingly. One of the most difficult things in my going in, for example, to brace the president on a lot of these things that he didn't want to hear, is you just don't go in and tell the President of the United States he's full of it, and you just don't do that, particularly at 30, early 30s, right. You don't do it. And I tried to argue, present a case to him that I thought would result in him pounding his fist on the table and saying, we got to end this. This is clearly an obstruction of justice. We've got to stop it, and that's it. Those are your orders to end it. Well, I realized that he did just the opposite. I knew he was fully aware of what was going on, and that he wanted it to go on, and he wanted me to play that game. And I was not. By doing that, I knew I'd removed myself as the desk officer for the cover-up. So that was my way to get out, but try to force other people to come forward and end it.
To move ahead a bit, does it surprise you where we're at recently with our government?
I could never have anticipated, well, I always planned when I turned 60 I would return to writing because I enjoy it. But I had to go out and make a living first, and you never know as an author if you'll sell one book or many books, so I had to be comfortable financially that I could write, and got there. I was very lucky to have good partners and a good business career when I left Washington. But I could never have figured I'd be writing the books that I ended up writing, which are pretty rough commentary, because it strikes me that the Republicans, my old tribe, didn't learn a thing from the mistakes we made. And indeed, we wrote the book on what not to do, but yet they've not only added some chapters, they've gone way beyond what anyone would think a proper use of power should be.
When you talk about proper use of power, and then you talk about, well, we had 9/11, and we're at war, and all of those things, how do you decide what is for the best interest of the country? How can you know in a time that we're facing that we're doing what we should be? Shouldn't we give up something for this security?
Had I just jumped into it after 9/11, I might have had a different perspective. But what happened is I was writing a bi-weekly column and happened to notice right after the Bush administration, for example, came in, that they were literally pulling the shades, slamming the doors, issuing executive orders to end all transparency in government. The Clinton administration had gone exactly the opposite, tried to be as open and declassify as much information as they conceivably could that was within the national interest. So they came in with an agenda long before 9/11 to really bulk up the presidency. Part of that is use of secrecy. And as I say, this is pre-9/11. I first was tipped off to this when I read a column by George Will a conservative commentator who had been down to Austin to visit the then Governor Bush and his staff, because he was obviously at that point getting ready in late 1998 to start making a presidential bid. One of the things George well noticed on the desk of several staffers was a book by Terry Eastland called Energy in the Executive. Well, I was familiar with this book. It's become something of the Bible for the strong presidency by conservatives, and it's a very telltale sign. It's not well known outside those circles, but it explains their philosophy that really developed during the Reagan years to take the presidency where it's never been taken, which is to take the so-called Nixon imperial presidency and put it on stilts and pump it full of steroids and make it into a real beast, if you will, for exercising power.
But why? Why is this something they want to do?
I was also able to find pretty much the moment that conservatives, particular, because I still to this day, on many issues, consider myself a Goldwater conservative. And conservatives are traditionally very apprehensive about aggregations of power, particularly in the presidency. When I read literature about the conservative movement in college, for example, it was very harsh on what FDR had done building up the presidency and stepping across the line versus the other branches of government. So I was surprised when I saw this happening. I was surprised when I saw it happening during the Nixon years. And then it's obviously snubbed as a result of Watergate and then resumes during the Reagan years. You say, why? The reason why is they felt that Watergate and Vietnam had somehow weakened the presidency and that the presidency was out of balance. This was the initial explanation. But it really takes its great giant leaps forward following the Reagan, late in the Reagan presidency, and then when Newt Gingrich succeeds in taking control of the House of Representatives, what happens is Newt goes nose to nose, toe to toe with Bill Clinton on the budget, because he believes that the Congress itself can become the dominant Republican conservative branch of the government. But Bill Clinton runs circles around him and absolutely, slices him at the knees, and Newt doesn't even know why he's getting so much smaller. But he's had, in short. And after that, Republicans realize that they need the power of the presidency, and that's when they go full bore to build up and add strength to the presidency. And it's been a constant march. So what happens when you get to 9/11 is this is used as a pretext to add even further and greater powers to the presidency. And that's been a steady activity of the Bush-Cheney administration since 9/11. Actually, it starts before, but I'm saying they accelerate with 9/11, and this gives them a lot of cover because they've taken the executive branch where nobody has taken it before, using the pretext, well, the terrorists are going to get us. They have fear-mongered us into where people really ask few questions about what's happening.
And have they fear-mongered us, or do they truly believe what they're saying? They might not be right, but do they believe it?
Well,
do you think?
I don't think any of these people are evil. I don't think they have goals or desires that are in any way improper. I don't, for that matter, think Nixon, in his abuses of power, had evil motives. They do it for two reasons. One is their own. They get people in the White House, people in the executive branch, people in big positions get caught up in their own wisdom very easily. I know. And the second thing is, it is become fundamental to their belief of how best to govern. That they don't want to hear the other side of the story. They don't want to look at the dangers of aggregating power in the presidency, for example. Some don't even want to believe another Democrat will ever have those powers at their hand. In fact, when Bill Clinton came in, he was considered an imperial president by many Republicans, yet he twisted it around and used the powers they'd given him for what he thought were another set of goals, which the conservatives were very upset with. You know, this concept of the so-called unitary executive theory, which Americans first heard about during the Alito confirmation hearings to go to the Supreme Court. I think that's the first time many members of the Senate ever heard that term. And what it is, it's a theory that was cooked up by a bunch of lawyers, drawing some language from one of the Federalist Papers by Alexander Hamilton, where he meant we shouldn't have a council of 3 or more people involved in the presidency. They want to now, they've used that to really put the president's imprint and through the White House staff on everything. This really starts during Nixon, where the White House staff starts expanding and growing. It continues during Reagan. It is contracted during Clinton, but now has been resumed during Bush. And Bush has all these signing statements where he says, well, if Congress can't do that, can't tell me how to run the executive branch because of this unitary executive theory, and it is a frightening prospect.
Can we reel it back in? Is it too far gone?
I think we have to reel it back in. I was very disappointed when Alan Greenspan came out with his book, which, because of his position of one of the most important independent regulatory agencies, the Federal Reserve, that he might say something about the unitary executive theory, how dangerous it would be if the president could tell the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve how to run their business. But yet he said nothing. He was silent on it. I'm not sure we can. I'm not sure we can totally reel it back in. The people who refuse to reel it back in are those 25% hardcore authoritarian Republicans and conservatives who believe this is the way this country can best be run. And they don't want checks and balances. They don't like the system we have. And they don't want to be troubled with trying to amend the Constitution. They'll just build up the presidential power.
They are timing me out, so last comment, give us some hope. What do we have?
I have a lot of hope. I happen to believe that if the American people have information, by and large, they do the right thing. They have the knowledge. Somebody gives them, an honest broker tries to give them information. They will make a wise judgment. I think the jury system is the perfect example. 12 people, different educations, different walks of life, give them a lot of facts in a short period of time. 99 out of 100 times, juries come out right. So do voters.
And we are out of time. Thank you so much. An honor to talk with you.
Thank you.
John Dean.
To order a DVD of this or any episode of Interviews, please visit HoustonPBS.org.